All righty, gang. Welcome to the Team 3DMJ podcast. I'm joined here by fellow head coaches Brian Miner and the Godfather, Jeff Alberts. Gentlemen, thank you. Let's talk about today fatigue. And forgive me if I get on a little bit of a rant, because this is something that's kind of hit home here as of late. But fatigue and fatigue management, right? And I guess I'll start it off with a little bit of background. In fact, I want to say that I got a little reel coming out here sometime soon. The demonization of fatigue here recently. If it causes fatigue, it's bad and it's going to block your progress and it's non-hypertrophic. And yeah, all things bad about fatigue. And I just kind of wonder, how far does the pendulum have to swing from the one side, go hard or go home, versus, well, let's just get in the gym and just do the bare minimum that we can possibly do to not generate any fatigue and hopefully grow here a little bit. So, yeah, gentlemen, fatigue, correct me if I'm wrong, it's kind of a necessary evil, isn't it? Isn't it something that is going to be generated whenever you're doing any form of physical training?
Yeah, yeah. Any
You look
productive
surprised,
trainings,
Brian. You're like, is he asking me that?
any productive training is going to cause. I mean, you experience fatigue across a set, and so I think what a lot of people are fear mongering over is making sure that there's not any excess fatigue beyond what's required to achieve a hypertrophic stimulus. And that's a good goal to have on paper, but there's always going to be some degree of residual fatigue that might be accumulating that you can't fully account for. And then I also think a lot of the discussion around fatigue, it's a subjective term that has actual definitions based off of what you're referring to specifically. So um subjective fatigue can be influenced by you know fatigue in our central nervous system, fatigue within the muscle, our motivation to train. I would even throw like joint discomfort into that. So I think the way I describe fatigue would be anything that can potentially take away from your ability to perform. And there's a lot of variables that fall under that umbrella. But I think managing those, there's been this arguably overemphasis on making sure that things are as well managed as possible, to the point where I think some people are missing out on productive stretches of training almost out of fear of doing too much, which is sort of different than what things were like even 2 years ago, I would say. We'd get applications, and I remember, and it's still probably the case to some extent, but it's closing, where someone would apply and provide their existing training to us, and we would, okay, where do we go from here? I would say 10% of the time was I increasing someone's volume. It was definitely more common for me to be scaling back for people. And over the past couple of years, I have noticed, more people coming through where it's like, okay, this is like, you can see that sort of fear of doing too much in their application. And they're doing a pretty minimalistic approach to things, which there's nothing wrong with that, but there's also probably a middle ground where, we can thrive.
Yeah, because I think for me, I would say probably about 9 times out of 10, maybe 8 out of 10, you're downsizing people's volume. And it's not because you're fearful of the fatigue. You just know, because chances are we get an application, they're more beginner, intermediate. I mean, we do get advanced athletes, but more times than not, the advanced athletes aren't doing more than that they can handle because they know themselves really well. It's more the beginner intermediate. You're like, okay, why are they doing so much volume? And it's not so much the fatigue I worry about, it's more so the efficiency, like the quality of their movements and the actual stimulus per set that they're actually getting out of it. So it's always trying to make them more efficient. And then from there, it comes down to managing fatigue for me with athletes. Because it's about supply and demand. You know, regardless if you're doing 20 sets, 10 sets, whatever, like you're trying to get as much stimulus. You're trying to from the dose that you're doing, but you got to be able to recover from it. And fatigue, I mean, it could come from so many different directions. It could come from the training itself. It could come from exercise selection. It could come from rep ranges that you're working in. It could come from just how you're managing life itself. And we're not perfect robots, so it's tough to get a stranglehold on everything all at the same time. So it's interesting to me that you guys are bringing this subject up because it almost seems like a few years back or even beyond that was always, like you said, Brad, go hard or go home. And now it seems like it's kind of swinging to this, like everybody is fearful of doing too much now or doing the wrong things or I can't squat or deadlift because they say it causes too much fatigue and it's not worth doing it. You're not going to get as much reward out of it, which comes down to how you program things.
Agreed.
Yeah, and we were talking about this off the call before we started, but usually the way that I assess how fatigue is affecting our training is simply by kind of programming certain movements in a certain way that we can actually see progress. So if we have 50%, 30%, 20% of our program where we can actually, we're not even trying to progress. We're not trying to apply any progressive overload. We're not trying to do any linear periodization or anything. We're just training. We're just training to a certain, I like to use myself instead of just random tangent numbers. I kind of like to use RIR and RPE. And let's track a set that is super, super, super consistent. And if over the course of weeks, we see progress, we see that there is either an increase in repetitions, which is what we see most of the time, or B, the same number of repetitions is getting easier and easier and easier and easier, regardless of what's happening on fatigue side, we are able to progress and therefore we're overcoming the fatigue that is coming from our training. Likewise, the flip side of that is like, okay, if we're tracking certain variables over the course of time and we're seeing digression, we're seeing that things are moving backwards. We're getting less repetitions on that final AMRAP, we'll call it, or that final failure repetition, right? And we're seeing that slowly over time, we're getting less and less and less reps. Well, maybe now we need to kind of start figuring out what is causing that. And maybe then we start making adjustments as far as bringing some volume down, right? But we got to kind of get this assessment in order to know if we are overcoming the fatigue or if the fatigue is kind of overcoming us. So that's kind of how I assess it and kind of how I manage whether or not we are handling fatigue well. But I get that first before I start figuring out how do we manage fatigue? What do we alter? What can we do outside of life that might be causing excess fatigue, and things like that. But I kind of use performance variables first and then start going over things like you mentioned, Jeff. Are you getting enough sleep? Are you hydrated? Are you getting into the gym and making sure that your urine is clear and just kind of things like that. But Jeff, you seem to be like a master of being able to manage that supply and demand and being able to, in your own training, do enough that, of course, it generates fatigue, but your performance is overcoming that fatigue and you're still able to progress and you're still able to keep your performance levels high. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about that, how you kind of establish those things in your training and then also in your clients.
So supply and demand, the way I see it is your supply is going to be your nutrition, like your food level. It's going to be rest days. It's going to be sleep, refeeds, those types of things. The demand is going to be the training itself. It could be your step count or your cardio. It could be if you're prepping or whatever, or you're cutting down, it's a deficit itself. That's a demand. And then you factor in, outside things, work, that type of stuff. So I always try to, factor that. Okay, I'm always trying to keep, if I'm not cutting or in a prep, I'm trying to keep the supply above the demand because that's going to yield a better training environment. You're going to be well fueled. You'll be able to perform. Therefore, you're going to be able to recover better as well. If you're prepping, you're going to have your demand outpacing your supply because you're in a deficit. The thing is, you don't want that demand to get way out in front of the supply. So that might be like, okay, we're trying to keep your, rate of loss half to 1% of your body weight per week. It might mean, okay, we need to take a refeed, 2 refeeds, 3 refeeds, diet break, whatever, to give you a temporary relief. So we bring the demand down, bring the supply up, recharges your batteries, and you get to go again. Now, if I look at outside of bodybuilding and we look at other sports, they do a really good job of managing fatigue, but yet what's it all about in sports? Performance. You're not going to see Kobe Bryant jogging down the court going, I'm scared to generate too much fatigue. He's got to play hard. He's got to score some points in order to win the game at the end. Now, you look at NBA basketball, and of course, we have to look at, good teams, bad teams, that type of thing. But in general, when they play back-to-back games, the losing percentage goes up on a back-to-back game. Why is that? Well, they just played a hard game.
Mm-hmm.
The next day, they're turning around trying to do it again. So they're not going to win as much because the fatigue is setting in. So they play maybe 2-3 games a week. They make sure there's rest days in between so they can, be able to play on a high level. And we're talking about an 82-game season, playoffs, all that good stuff. You look at a baseball pitcher, look at, the managers have pitch counts. They have pitch counts for a reason, because if they get over a certain number of pitcher, I'm sure each manager knows each pitcher and what their thresholds are. And that's what's important as bodybuilders. We know where our thresholds are at. But if this pitcher's going with a high pitch count, that manager knows the velocity on the fastball is going to go down. The control of the pitches isn't going to be there. So they got to pull that pitcher out because otherwise they're probably end up losing the game. And then there's also a rotation with starting pitchers. They'll pitch every 4 or 5 games or whatever the case may be because they know they can't go every single game and be able to pitch on a high level. You can go any other sport and it's going to be similar where they're managing fatigue, but yet they're trying to get as much performance as possible. But as bodybuilders, I see this all the time. It's the two camps, right? It's like more. Or now it's like you said, Brad, it's going to slide the other way where they're not doing enough.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of have to learn your threshold where you can get a really good stimulus, but yet you're able to fully recover. And I can tell you this, the last 2 bodybuilders that I've talked to on video calls, I have one guy that does a 5-day split, hits everything twice per week, and he does 2 weeks of that. So he goes 5 days, 2 weeks. What he notices is, and we've noticed this together, is the second week of that training, he gets like the fatigue towards the end of the second week, he gets really fatigued. So the third week, we go take it down to 3 days per week. So he hits everything pretty much once per week. So after that week, he feels awesome. And this is the lowest frequency of volume, whatever he's ran in quite a long time. And he's noticed like a significant improvement in performance because we're managing the recovery really well. So he's still training hard, but he's pulling back when that fatigue gets a little bit escalated. Now, because of that performance has gone up, and you guys can probably attest to this, shit gets harder. When you're lifting heavier and heavier and you're doing more and more reps, it gets harder to do every single time. Common sense tells you if it gets harder, it's going to require more recovery unless you're just adapting extremely well. But most cases, you're going to start to notice more fatigue creeping up as performance goes up. So doing more work, more frequency, or more volume is going to be counterproductive towards that performance. Any other sport kind of tells us that as well. So now it's like he's ran a couple of blocks with that setup. The last call I had with him, the fatigue is creeping up even higher because of that performance. So now we're going 1 week, 5 days, 1 week, 3 days. It's alternate every other week. So theory, we'll see what happens in the end, but I'm going to assume his performance is going to continue to elevate because we're keeping up on that supply and demand. The same thing on the call I actually had before the podcast today. Same concepts that we put in place, just different programming because it's a different athlete, but same principles are applying. And I've noticed this with myself over the years. When we first started coaching, Brad, remember the hot water I used to get all the time because I was training 3 days a week. And I would always tell people, recovery should be an equal part of your process.
Mhm.
Like I got bashed for that because it was more about more volume, this. But it's just, I've learned over the years, like you want to get a good, yes, you're going to push yourself in the gym. You have to do that in order to get a good stimulus, but you're going to have to get the recovery as well. So it's not this camp or this camp. It's kind of like Brian said, it's like right in the middle. You got to learn where your thresholds are at. And the amount of work you're doing and the amount of recovery, it's going to evolve over time. It's going to depend on, your current environment, and the environment can change, whether it's bodybuilding type of environment or home life or work life or whatever. You have to evolve with it. And that's what's super important. So anybody that kind of asks like, how much volume, hey Jeff, how much volume should I be doing? Like, I don't know. It's like, you got to get in there, set something up, let it play out, and make adjustments based on these principles I talk about. And that's where I usually see like the best progress over time.
I love that analogy
That's kind of a longer
too.
rant, but
That was good.
It was awesome because I love the analogy that you made with the NBA players and how their performance declines when they do those double headers and they're doing those back to backs, because it's not like they're not trying. It's not like they're now jogging and they're purposely missing shots, right? They're still trying their best. They're still giving 100%, but the fatigue is mounted and it's masking their ability to perform. Maybe they're just a tick off when they're sprinting up and down the court. Maybe they're just the coordination is just not quite there, on the
like
shot.
there's a big debate like in the NBA, because I'm a big NBA fan. Like, some people will give some NBA players shit because they don't like to play the second back to back. They choose to sit out, or the coach keeps them out. And I can see the fans' perspective. Hey, I'm paying $100 for this ticket.
To see these people.
I don't get to see. He's not playing. Like, I get that part of it, but from the principles we're talking about, it makes complete sense.
It makes perfect sense. Yeah.
And then you'll have some people say, well, Michael Jordan played all 82 games. He played in playoffs, never missed a game. It's like Michael Jordan, like he's, in my opinion, like a genetic outlier, right?
And which
like
they're those
gifted,
in every sport. Yeah.
Mentally, he's on another. It's like looking at a Doug Miller and saying, okay, Doug Miller does a crazy amount of volume, but also he has the mindset and the mentality to really get after it. And he adapts to that work really well. He recovers really well. Not everybody's a Doug Miller. Not everybody's a Michael Jordan. Yeah. So some people can do more and get after, but other people not so much. So a lot of it comes down to personality as well.
Yeah, and makeup. I totally agree with you. With CrossFit, Matt Frazier and Rich Froning, there's a reason why there was only those two guys in CrossFit, and it goes a lot. I've talked with folks that tried to keep up with those guys, and you know where it got them? All kinds of just metabolic duress, to where they just couldn't function right, performing to those levels of volume, because their bodies, just God could not give them the same recuperative abilities as those people. There's a reason why those people are so rare. But I just love your analogy, because that's what fatigue does to us. It blocks our ability to perform. And that's why I like to kind of set up these performance variables to be able to track if we are overcoming the fatigue or if the fatigue is actually blocking us. And that was awesome, Jeff, that little dissertation. So Brian, I want to give you a chance to get in here too, because I know that you use performance variables a lot as well. And I'd kind of like to hear, because just listening to Jeff, I'm like, wow, I got to reassess how I'm doing things.
No, that was great. And I think it also, I mean, you look at resistance training for, like, when people, listen to what you just said, Jeff, they might think, okay, that's like a skill, an athletic performance. They're performing their sport. But like there's a reason resistance training is less on in season for professional athletes. There's only so much supply that they have available when they're playing an 82 game season and maybe practicing or doing morning shoot arounds or whatever. So that's should tell us enough, like that there is this cost with resistance training where you can't do too much. But to your point, Brad, like when people talk about recovery, you have to kind of peel back and see like what are you referring to? I think a lot of people look at recovery and define it as like, okay, when I'm not sore anymore, and that's oftentimes sort of the metric people have, which isn't useless, but not super reliable either. But in sports science, recovery is usually defined as like a return to baseline performance. And so in order to improve, you have to at least be recovering back to baseline, or in typically you're seeing your fitness level increase. And so, the supply and demand, or like the fitness and fatigue model was what really kind of drove it home for me when I learned about that, where, every set, think of it as like two bar charts, like every session we do increases our fitness. And I think a better way to describe fitness would be like our adaptations, our positive adaptations. And then in this other bar, we've got fatigue. And as we, this will hopefully just keep inching up over time. But once this fatigue kind of catches up, like that difference between the two is our ability to perform. So when fatigue closes that gap enough to the point where we can no longer push our adaptations higher, then that's when it needs to be addressed. A lot of people are managing just fine and they decide to get under the hood and start messing with things. And I think looking, like I sometimes I worry that like I sound insulting when I talk to people like athletes like this, where it's like, okay, do we want, like, I understand your concern here, but like we can't forget to look at the bottom line. Like our bottom line is our performance. If that's our primary metric, if that's trending up, then like isn't everything that you were concerned about not irrelevant, but you're still checking the box that we actually care about.
Yeah.
It's like, do you want to, the irony here is a lot of people want to know that they're doing things the optimal way, even if they're making good progress otherwise. But we never know when we're there anyway. So like it's a spot on a map that we can never find. And I think we can use science to kind of guide us in those directions. Like we were talking about rep ranges earlier and, before the call, and, we know higher reps are going to be more neuromuscularly fatiguing. Like if you take a set of squats, 15 RM compared to like a 5 RM, pretty much every marker of fatigue is going to be higher in the 15 RM squat, right? So your quality of work will probably see a significant drop off in the next sets. And that's something that I always find interesting. Like if you're matching effort set to set, how much does your performance drop in terms of number of reps from set to set if you're using like the same load? And it really depends on the rep range. More kind of the lower to more moderate rep ranges, you might only lose a rep or two. Whereas if you're doing 15, you might lose 30% of your reps, by that next set. And so like that's an example of where people are looking at some of what the research says that's validated in the sense that, yeah, we know objectively this is more fatiguing. But we also know that in the grand scheme of things, our bottom line being hypertrophy, I guess in this example, probably isn't going to be significantly different, if at all. And I think a lot of the fatigue discussion and a lot of the fear regarding fatigue overlooks the fact that we're very adaptable. If you take somebody who's never trained above 10 reps and you program all of their lower body work with high reps, like they're going to be absolutely trashed. And in the short term, they're probably not going to make as good of progress if you could even measure it on that time scale. But they start to adapt to that. They increase their buffering capacity, their work capacity, and you start to see like maybe it was a 30% drop off in performance is now maybe a 15% drop off in performance. And so just being exposed to some of this stuff for a long enough time, I think results in that theoretical gap in outcome closing and kind of explaining what we observe in the research, that it's not that it doesn't matter. It's just, I think if you do it long enough, it probably doesn't matter enough to really worry too much about. And you should do what you enjoy and what makes sense from an efficiency perspective. So like I have no reason.
But let's say you did 5 reps squats and then all of a sudden you're up to 15. Yeah, acutely you're gonna be like, holy shit, that's hella
You're not gonna
tiring.
walk.
Like, the next day you're gonna be like, oh, I'm sore. Like, okay, well, the way I'm gonna take a couple of extra rest days in there and recover, and then okay, let me do it again. I'm gonna be a little better at it, and then maybe I'm taking 2 or 3 rest days in between those sessions. Well, maybe it gets to be only 1 day after that because I've adapted.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, when someone throws this information out there, like it's black or white information, like it's either this or it's either that. It's like there's no context around that. Like it doesn't have to be just that. It's the shades of gray matter a lot.
Yeah. And shades of gray and social media cannot coexist. It seems like,
Isn't that the truth?
And that's like one reason, like
because it's like you'll see, well, what's better, 5 reps or is it 15? Like what is better?
Yeah, it's like okay, well,
they both can work in your favor depending on the context.
Exactly. And people just don't want to, a lot of people are unwilling to really, well, it's not, those aren't great platforms. Like you lose your audience once you start talking context, which kind of eliminates the point, I guess. So, but I agree with you completely. And I think right now there was some recent, research looking at training volume, assessing like, okay, maybe the top end benefit is a lot higher than what most people suspect. And so there's still kind of these extremes where people look like, oh, well, if I do exorbitant amounts of volume, like I can, make better progress, at least in the short term. Then you have the other camps, other extreme that's like, don't do anything above 8 reps. Like you're stupid if you do anything above 8 reps because you're causing excess fatigue.
I saw that. Let's talk about that.
Well, if you're not, if you're somebody who's trying to find your footing in your own fitness journey and you're getting exposed to both of these simultaneously, which a lot of people have over the last 6 months, it's like there's more confusion right now, I think, is the consumer of this information than maybe there ever has been, because there's a lot of polarizing views on topics right now. And so you really have to defer back to, am I improving? Is this sustainable? And if it is, if you've been training any length of time and you can measure like quantifiable progress in performance from one block to a next, or a trend up across the year, it's like that's good progress and you should sustain that. And one topic that I think I briefly mentioned before the call, but I don't think gets enough attention, is a lot of people are looking, like everybody wants progress as fast as possible, and it's understandable. I mean, you want to do what's most efficient at a given point in your training career. But for natural athletes, a lot of people, if you've been training, if you train for a decade plus or 2 decades, if you're in this for the long haul, you're going to get close to your genetic potential, probably regardless of how you approach this, as long as it's sustainable. That's my opinion. I think if you're able to keep showing up, you're not sidelined with injuries for sustained periods of time. I think that's the bottleneck for a lot of people, is they push. I mean, I did some really dumb shit early in my training career in terms of volume. Brad, like Smolov, you probably ran Smolov.
I was just going to talk about Smolov. Yeah.
And it's like at the end of that, you get rewarded for your bad behavior in a way. You know, you can set this big squat PR, but it's like you can barely walk, you know, throughout those 3 weeks. And so it's tough in that regard because you want to make the most progress possible, but at the end of the day, if you're like, you know, it's not sustainable. So find a strategy that is sustainable, a layout that's sustainable, that leads to the most predictable outcomes for you. And one shift I've had probably just in the past 6 months even, was kind of getting away from training muscle groups 2 times in 7 days. My brain likes to operate on like a clean, okay, I'm training this on this day, and neatly packaged training week. And I just realized where I'm at in my stage of life, like it has to be more dynamic than that. And so right now I have like a torso day basically, and then arms, and then I take a day off, and then I do arms usually before my leg session, and then I'll train legs after, and then I'll take another day off. So I have 3 rest days between hitting the same muscle group again, like if we're talking chest and back or legs. And I find just having that additional rest day, not only does it help my recovery, I think it helps me mentally within the session know that like, okay, I've got tomorrow off. I'm able to push. Like I get more out of my effort. Like I'm more deliberate in
That's
my
important.
training, knowing that I have
some of this
a
is
day off
mental.
after.
Yeah.
No, it's a lot of it's psychological, and I think that doesn't get talked about enough. Is the layout that makes you eager to go in and train each day. I think you can get more out of your training having a setup like that than agonizing over the details. Should I be doing 12 sets or 18?
Yeah, you can be physically fine doing something, but it could be mentally fatiguing.
Yeah.
And then you're not putting the effort in.
Back squats are an example. Like my last off season, that was like my primary squat movement, and my knees started to ache after a while. And like, I'm at a place now where I can do them. Like my knees are a lot better than they were 2 years ago, but it's like, it's just the thought of doing them. I'm like, I would just get more output out of doing like a hack squat here. Like, I think I'm going to be more constrained by my, like, just them rubbing me the wrong way, from 2 years ago than just picking a better movement in the short term. And granted, if I stuck with it, I'm sure, I could get back there.
Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez hopping in to remind you about a completely free video course in the 3DMJ Vault called the Pro Bodybuilder Case Study. It's probably the closest, most detailed look at a full-blown contest prep cycle that you've ever seen or been able to follow in one centralized location. One of our 4 head coaches, Brad Loomis, will guide you through an entire 3-year stretch between competitive bodybuilding seasons with one of his longtime athletes and professional bodybuilders, Phil de Guzman. We are so grateful that Phil let us use him as a subject because he and Brad kept phenomenal records, both in their spreadsheets and visually with his progress photos, so that we could track his physique and body weight throughout the whole process. You'll get to follow his career from when he won his first PNBA Pro card in 2020, through his initial recovery phase, through his first cut to make weight for a powerlifting meet, through his second and more robust off-season gaining phase, through his initial prep positioning diet and preseason holding pattern, and finally through his final contest prep fat loss phase where he won his second WNBF Pro card in 2023. It's really such a unique perspective on not only what a time investment it takes to see the results of natural bodybuilding efforts, but also to see how we coach on a macro scale. In this case study course, which again is totally free, you'll get a sense of why we tell our future competitors they can't simply contact us just a few months before they want to get on stage and expect the best results possible. You'll see how Phil and Brad made their long-term timeline and how the big picture considerations allowed for the improvements they were looking for over a few years' time. This is also one of the big reasons that we've recently changed our coaching options and offerings here at 3D Muscle Journey. We know the value of getting athletes ready early and how it impacts their results down the line. So we created some more entry-level onboarding methods to set more people up for success like Phil's in the future. So this kind of leaves me with 2 pitches here. First off, like I've already said a bunch, go take the Pro Bodybuilder Case Study course. It's for free at 3dmjvault.com, and you'll get all the videos and be able to download Brad's presentation with all of Phil's plans and photos and everything you need to kind of see how this whole coaching machine works over time. And secondly, if you've ever thought of working with us for any goals in the distant future, we think that you should reconsider that and possibly get on the squad now to see how you and your coach can make the most impact together for the long haul. Now, of course, we offer competition coaching with weekly check-ins during the season and occasionally more touch points leading up to specific show dates. But now we also have some great onboarding options for non-competitors as well. There are some lower frequency bi-weekly check-in options and even some training only or nutrition only coaching selections for those who just need help with specific parts of their athlete journey. You can always find links for coaching details on our main website at 3dmusclejourney.com. And additionally, we've got those coaching details directly linked throughout Brad and Phil's course as well, in case you get inspired to sign up while watching the videos in real time. So go ahead and head on over to 3dmjvault.com and check out the Pro Bodybuilder Case Study today. That's 3dmjvault.com to get instant access. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy the rest of the show.
Let's talk about the exercise selection and fatigue and all that, because there's the stimulus to fatigue ratio when it comes to these movements. So what's your guys' thoughts on that, and how do you program as far as exercise selection in that regards?
If there's a particular, like for squats for me are something that I love to do. I literally love to squat. I love doing a good heavy squat. And if there was somebody like me that loved to squat and they were coming onto my roster and they came to me and they said, wow, coach, I didn't want to squat this week. Like I was literally dreading going into that session to do a squat. We probably better change something because something's not quite right there, And I've noticed that with me, as much as I love to squat, if I squat too much in a week, mentally, I don't want to go in there. And if mentally I don't want to go in there, Brian, this goes back to what you were saying. I'm not going to give 100%. And that's kind of one of the many ways that, Jeff, you kind of alluded to as far as programming goes. Sure, okay, maybe squatting twice a week is optimal because we're hitting the muscle groups twice. If you don't want to squat on one or any of those days, something's got to change. I don't care what's optimal. You're going to get more out of going in there and really getting after it one day a week, or, just kind of going through the motions and half-ass doing it on the second day, right? And I'm not opposed to people who love a movement like that, hitting it, like you said, Brian, in kind of a dynamic fashion, hitting it again in 7 days, hitting again in 10 days. Now they're ready to go, and maybe they'll hit it again every fourth day. But you have to and this is something we can talk about a little bit later. You have to take into consideration mental fatigue as well. If you take something that you love doing and you don't like doing it anymore, there's a little bit of mental fatigue that's going on right there, and you need to kind of manage that as well. But yeah, that's one thing, Jeff, that I'll kind of do from a mental standpoint, much less what Brian was talking about. Maybe you do find out that if you squat 3 times a week, belt squat one day, whatever your setup is, and all of a sudden your hip is getting flared up or your adductor is just aching to the point that you can't sit, something's got to change there, because you've got to be able to be healthy and have that adductor actually work when you're getting to your movements that you're trying to, get the stimulus that you're wanting to get from it. So a lot of us having to try to find at least a baseline. Have you been doing what have you been doing, and is it working? Okay, well, let's just stick with it for a while and we'll track our metrics. But if someone comes to me and they say, yeah, I used to love doing this and I hate doing it now, well, we probably better look at what it is that you've been doing and then adjust accordingly.
What about if it's someone that loves to do it, but someone paired it to them, or they're looking social media or saying you shouldn't squat because it causes too much fatigue and it's going to be counterproductive towards hypertrophy, let's say. Like they're just trying you to get you to avoid doing the movement because it's a hard movement.
Yeah. And that's where we got to use our critical thinking skills, right? I mean, I would hope that most of our listeners would kind of take that and they would say, but you know what?
Because it puts the movements in a bad, like, okay, squats are now in a bad camp, or deadlifts are in a
Exactly.
bad camp. Now, like, it's bad. You should always avoid it at all costs.
It's like
Yeah.
Especially if you're
all of the tiered exercise videos on
Right.
YouTube right now. Like,
so again,
am I not allowed to do anything below like the B tier now? You know,
So let's say for me, I love doing squats, Brian. I want to do these, but it's this guy's over here saying I shouldn't do them. How can we do them? Can we program it? How are we going to do that to ensure I can get the stimulus and not get too much fatigue from it, and we can keep this going?
I think the way I would approach that, well, the short answer is yes, you can keep doing it, because I think
Thank gosh.
when people, so the stimulus to fatigue ratio, I think it's a valuable concept to understand. You know, there's not any way to really accurately know for sure, you know, what, I mean, you can score based on different categories, and I forget what all metrics people use. Like I think Mike Isertel originally coined that, and I'm not sure. I think maybe soreness was maybe one of them. I mean, I think like muscle length could be maybe another one that could be included in there if it's not already. Axial loading, you know, do you have a bar on your back? So like I get that there's different things that you want to control while maximizing the stimulus. But if somebody really enjoys a movement, it's not just about managing the fatigue cost of it. If they enjoy a movement, they're going to get a better stimulus probably out of that movement. So you can't, like the stimulus to fatigue ratio conversation sort of ignores preferences. And I think that's equally as important when it
Or
comes to
even
getting,
ignore like equipment limitations too, because
True,
10 years
yeah.
ago, like
yeah.
this is the reason I'm kind of like, I don't know if I'm like upset about it, but it irks me because 10 years ago, I didn't have a leg press. I didn't have hack squat. I didn't have a bunch of equipment in my garage. I just had a squat rack and a barbell. So it's like I was squatting twice a week and deadlifting once a week, all through my prep, all the way to the end of prep. It was more about managing the programming and the fatigue you get from that. But you can definitely do it in a way where you're still productive.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Like those movements didn't suddenly become ineffective 2 years ago, you know, like those, whenever this terminology originated, like it's useful, but 100%, it's not like the end all be all. Yeah, I think when it comes to exercise selection, availability, like logistics, I guess, you know, do you have access to it? If it's at the gym, but it's always used and you're going to be having to like change it every other week, maybe we just pick a different movement. And I think just being mindful not to overdo things. So it's not like in isolation, a back squat and a deadlift, like they're not detrimental in isolation. You know, if you did back squats and then you were deadlifting twice a week, let's say you were back squatting, low bar back squatting 3 times a week, and you were deadlifting heavy 2 times a week, and then doing RDLs, like that's when it becomes an issue. Yeah. So like when you're looking at individual, like the problem I have with those rankings and even the stimulus to fatigue ratio is you need to consider everything else that you're doing, because that can influence whether or not that's a good or a bad decision. And I think like I had mentioned joint discomfort. I think that's another big one. It's like, as an example, like training at longer muscle lengths, you know, like in my training I was doing, and I still have this for some people that can handle it, but like Bayesian curls and like a free weight preacher curl. And on paper, those have a high stimulus, but probably higher fatigue also because you're training at a longer muscle length. But what I found was, for me, including both of those hard within a week, it was almost too much.
Too much
for
for
my
elbows.
bicep tendon. And so it's you can have too much of a good thing too. Like a lot of the stuff that, you know, like length and partials, it's an efficient stimulus for sure. It's a way to get a little bit more out of a movement, but it does have a cost associated with it. If you use it strategically, that cost can be worth, the outcome. But if you spend recklessly on those types of things, then you're going to end up in a worse position. So it's like there's now this whole anti-science camp on social media, it seems like, which I'm not like that's annoying. Just people can't think in terms of a middle ground here. But within that camp, it's like I think one kind of critique against some of the research that I think is sort of a valid critique is a lot of these studies that look at specific interventions, they're comparing maybe two exercises, or I mean, not all of them, but like it's rare to have like a complete full program within a study over a long enough duration with a demographic similar, an advanced training age, like that doesn't happen very often. So we're left to sort of infer like, okay, this is, comparing a seated leg curl versus a lying leg curl. That's a good example where people saw the seated leg curl had greater like biceps femoris growth. And so people started to write off lying leg curls. Like, okay, I don't want to do lying leg curls anymore. But then you have to consider, okay, what other lengthened stuff are you doing for your hamstrings in your training? Oh, you're doing RDLs?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, maybe you don't need to go to a different gym that has a seated leg curl because like you don't have to like, and I'll get that question, I'll get that question. Okay, is it important that I do this movement? Because then I'll have to go to this gym on this day and it's, 30 minutes from work. It's like, dude, like
That's not practical. Yeah.
This isn't practical. And you're going to make this experience miserable obsessing over the details like that. So like once I consider everything and distill it down, it's like there's the fundamental training principles that you want to follow. The research is helpful for sure, but it shouldn't be the end all be all in how you structure your training. Like you need to be pliable and understand like your own limitations, both in like your own life and, equipment availability, things like that. But finding something that you can stick to and be excited to train more often than not, and you're improving performance and staying healthy, it's like that you can't really ask
Almost
for much
trumps
more.
all.
You can't ask for more. I mean, you can in theory think, okay, well, if I did a little bit more or pick these better ratios, I might be able to get slightly better progress. But then once you implement that for a long enough period of time to know, it's like
You're
you could
probably
be in a
not
totally
even
different
gonna
situation by then.
And you're not going to truly know anyways.
You're not, no.
Unless you have every single variable in order. Like you do everything the same for a 6-month period. And I'm not just talking training. Like it's got to be nutrition, sleep, like everything's tightly controlled. And then you make the change. Like now you got to do it again for 6 months.
Yeah.
We're human.
Yeah.
So my pet peeve with social media is when someone says, I've added this to my back by doing this, or I added 1/2 inch to my arms doing this. And I'm like, I'm going to be very skeptical of it if I'm going to, let's say, get on someone's post, then I'm going to dive in and ask questions because I'm going to have skepticism. I want to know, did you tightly control everything? Did you do this? Did you do that? Like, I want to know exactly what they did. And then if they say, yeah, everything was very tightly controlled, everything checks out, then I'm like, okay, I'm a little bit more of a believer now. Not to say that what they did wasn't contributing. It probably might have just been part of many things that was going on. So that I just said, like, for me, that's kind of a pet peeve I have. Like, I try not to do that. I remember I used to do that. And now I'm kind of like, I don't do that anymore. I'm like, I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough one when they're pinpointing it on one specific thing. And I think
that
like,
goes into fatigue too. So if you're on social media and you're scrolling people constantly, that's a part of being fatigued too, because it's making you think like you're searching for this optimal thing.
And then you're stressing over it.
That's part of
stressing
fatigue.
over whether or not you're actually optimizing your training.
I believe there is some research showing like scrolling social media before training, or it can
think,
impact
I remember
performance.
Eric,
I forget what
I don't know
what the
I
details
don't remember
are.
exactly,
I mean,
but
it's
I
totally
remember Eric
believable. Like
going over that.
you're spending mental bandwidth on something that shouldn't really change what
Shouldn't
you're
be,
doing.
yeah, that's not going to contribute to your training at all. Yeah.
To your point though, Jeff, like I'll use Bert as an example here. So he brought up his back pretty considerably, I'd say, like the last 3 years. And it was kind of around the time that, some like the unilateral, more like single arm lat work was kind of becoming more popularized. People were doing it. They weren't sure why. Obviously like he had, valid reasons of doing it. But I think you would even ask him, was it that helped? And yeah, it could have contributed, but just observing it, and I've noticed this with my own back training, implementing that stuff. So I could use myself as an example here. I feel like when there's something novel that's like, oh, I've been doing this for 20 years, but this is interesting. Like when there's something novel that you're excited about, you're going to be so much more deliberate with your effort when you do that. And so like, was it the unilateral work that was, resulted in that spurt of progress, or was it like, okay, you're training with 50% more intent at this stage? And I know for me, it was probably more so just like it made back training more interesting. And so like I do think sometimes research keeps us engaged in the process because it's like, oh, that seems like it's worth a shot, and I'll implement that. But I'm always very careful to like hang any one thing too much off of that, okay, this is what drove that. Because in the real world, kind of what I was saying earlier about the studies, like that, you're probably not doing 15 to 20 sets per body part per week, when in some of these higher volume studies. And so you have limited resources. If you can't be training hard with every single muscle group across the board for a long enough period of time to know. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So it just seems like in order to isolate a variable in research, things often need to be a little bit more simplified, understandably. Like the programs need to be a little bit more streamlined. And usually the programs people are doing in the real world are a little bit more involved than that. And I think that can sort of change potentially how some of that outcome data is interpreted. And so it's like I look to research for concepts, not like a roadmap in a way.
100%.
Yeah, because
it's like, I think it's a bad idea to just disregard the science and say, and start bashing it. It's like, man, that's how we've gotten to where we are now with a lot of the things that we do. But like some people are doing things and they don't even realize like what they're doing is because of science.
Yeah.
Because we're all practitioners, right? And the difference between a practitioner and like a guru is that a practitioner, in my opinion, they look at the science, they look at the real world, like in the trenches type, and they kind of meld the worlds together in order to take all of that and apply it to each individual person and each individual, life and each individual variation between people. And that's where I kind of feel like we excel, is that we're able to take all of that stuff and actually apply it to somebody and disregard the stuff that doesn't matter. And then the things that we can include, maybe we pick what we feel are the biggest points or the biggest rate of return, and apply those things. You know what I mean? We're able to kind of put everything and not be this black and white. And where I kind of want to take that now is that time component, the fatigue over time, right? Because it's easy enough to say in the short term, let's just break it down to a individual exercise over the course of sets, right? Fatigue is going to mount, and we're going to see performance decline. 10 rep max, we're going to get 10 reps. The next one, we're going to get 5, and the next one, we're going to get 3. Fatigue has obviously been generated there, right? But then that's the short term. We have to talk about the long term as well. Smolov that you were talking about, Brian, I was able to progress fantastic for about 17 days. And then about 17, 18, 19, I was rapidly digressing. That pissed me off. made me work harder. And then, of course, now I've dug such a hole for myself, I can't even do the exercise I was intending to do, period, much less be able to progress. So we've got this level of fatigue that blocks our ability to perform over the course of a 3-4 sets. Then, of course, we've got the fatigue that mounts over the course of a longer period of time, or 5 weeks, say, for example. And then, of course, then you throw in all of the life variables that are in there, right? And that's where the practitioner comes in, because, okay, we're progressing right now. Maybe we do try adding in a little bit more. Maybe we can get a little bit more out of this. What's going on in life right now? Is everything good? Can we do this and not take away from other parts of your life that might stress you out? Oh, well, it just so happens I'm getting married in 2 months. Maybe we don't do that right now. It was working good. Maybe we just continue that and we kind of save that adjustment in volume or what the intensifiers or whatever for another period of time. Because fatigue it's very much a kind of a moving target, and we're not in a bubble. And we want to kind of consider all of those things that contribute to fatigue. So there's not only the fatigue that happens over the course of the sets that we're doing and the block that we're doing. We introduce fatigue sometimes willingly. We go into contest prep. Everything's been going great. We've been progressing awesome, but now we're going to diet, right? There is going to become a certain period of time when that fatigue is going to block our progress. And it's going to be our ability to kind of make sure that we're somewhat ahead of the game. And that's where, again, we come in as practitioners, because we've got the experience to kind of know, all right, this is when things kind of start to go awry, and we can make those kind of adjustments and make those kind of gut calls as a coach. That's going to help our athlete thrive, maximize, get on the stage with their best, up there. And that's kind of where I want to take things right now is we are all here for our clients to present their best, whether it's on the platform, on the bodybuilding stage. And as we're managing fatigue, we're making gut calls that we feel like are going to benefit them, are going to kind of help them, right? So I'll kind of kick this off. I learned this from Jeff in my last prep. I was doing lots of the post-failure partials. I really liked post-failure partials. I liked the way that I could track things very consistently. And Jeff made the call, you know what, Brad, I think that is generating too much fatigue. And considering that you're taking in 17...
No, I wasn't say I think. I said that is generating too much fatigue.
Thank you for that correction.
And it wasn't a gut call. It was based off of experience and common sense.
Exactly. Yeah. And so those are the kind of training adjustments that we probably all made in the past. But not only did he make that call as well, but I was following my calories very, very well, but the ratios weren't really where he wanted them to be. And so what we kind of found out was, well, Brad, I was basically taking very low carbs. And it wasn't like a purposeful drop in carbs I had. I was just able to adhere to the calories that I was taking in better when I took in higher protein, higher fat, and lower carbs. It was just working out that I could adhere to 1,700 calories better that way. Well, Jeff says, let's bring your protein and your fat down. And in addition to dropping these high fatigue intensifiers, let's give you more carbohydrate. It wasn't magic like night and day, but after about 4 or 5 days, sure enough, the decline in performance was now being mitigated. I was actually feeling, I don't think I was objectively, but at least subjectively, I was feeling like I was performing better. And while I was still starving to death, my energy levels went up, And so those training adjustments, yeah, I've done those before. But that was very enlightening, learning that, you know what, while calories matter, there is a certain amount of a point in time when, in order to manage fatigue, a little bit of the macros kind of matter as well. That wasn't a scientific study. That was Jeff, through his experience, making that call. And it manifested, and the fruits of it were proven right there in what I was doing.
Well, the reason to eliminate the partials, because you're already taking your set full range of motion to pretty
failure.
much failure. You're in a deficit, so the chances of you putting muscle on is nil.
Mm-hmm.
So the partials isn't going to help you retain muscle that much better. So all that you're doing is digging a deeper hole into your recovery because it's more of a demand. And that demand of those partials is not worth it because you're not getting the reward for it. So it's like, remove that. So you remove that effort. It's almost like wasted effort. It improves recovery right there. And then giving you more carbs and bringing the other macronutrients down, it's like your primary fuel source for training is going to be primarily from carbs. It's glycogen. So it's like, let's basically give you some more glycogen or fuel to work with. So just, again, supply and demand, that principle, it's like elevating the supply and bringing the demand down. So you just get better performance and better recovery. Now, if you're flip that around, you say, well, okay, now you're in the off season, you're in a surplus. It's like, okay, it's not hurting you too much to do the partials. And if it means you might get 1% more gains, I don't know if it's 1%, 5%, and you can recover from it because you're well fueled, by all means, let's do it. So it's just kind of depend on the context.
Yeah, I think that's kind of similar to an approach where somebody might increase calories or do a diet break during a deload week, where you're addressing both sides of the equation. And I think there's with prep, I mean, there's some finesse in terms of how to manage those situations. You need to know when it's necessary and when, it might just be kind of delaying fat loss potentially. But, a lot of times I've noticed with prep athletes is they might be stalled. It's not unusual for performance to be kind of stalled out. And granted, we don't expect linear performance improvements in contest prep. Like we expect a downward trend, on average, I would say. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that's unrelated to muscle loss, just to add that in there. But in many cases, when somebody is stalled in terms of like scale weight, and it's not uncommon for that to kind of go hand in hand with performance kind of training, feeling rougher than usual. And so if we were just to focus on like the input side of things, we would think, okay, let's increase the caloric deficit because the priority is fat loss here. Let's increase the caloric deficit. And really that will just make the whole situation worse, at least the performance side of things. And so oftentimes when you scale back, I guess, stimulus or expenditure and you increase the supply of calories, that increase in energy availability, essentially, you can recover better, but also progress. Like oftentimes people hit new lows after that. So, it seems counterintuitive on paper where people think like, okay, I'm in a deload, I'm burning less calories, which not by a ton. I mean, training isn't gonna, doing two less sets, like maybe you burn 40 extra or less calories on the day, like whatever.
Maybe 15.
So it's not significant, but people sometimes think like, okay, should I be reducing calories on rest days or on deload weeks? And like I don't ever really advise that.
It could be counterproductive.
It can be counterproductive.
Yeah.
And like sometimes people will stagger their intakes between like training days and off days. And that's like the nutrition equivalent of like almost not seeing the big picture. It's like, yeah, you're burning more on the training days, but like, if we want to use science, it's like, okay, your protein synthetic rates, maybe they're elevated 48 hours or something. Like you're still paying down that debt 24 hours after the training. That's when you want to capitalize on that stimulus. And so pulling back on that never made sense to me either.
Like even like back in my 20s, like my non-training days, like I was always taught like that's your recovery. Like you want to maximize that. You want to get your rest, but you also want to be well fed because that's when you're actually rebuilding. Yeah. So it never made sense to me to like lower calories down on non-training days, even through prep. Like refeed days, like program them on non-training days, because that's where you want to refuel and replenish. It's like a car analogy, a race car. Get around the track for about 100 laps. Like, okay, we pull it into the pit stop. You need more gas. You need new tires. Tune the motor up, so that way you can get back out there and race really well. So it never made sense for me to bring calories down on deloads or on like rest days.
Yeah. Usually, if somebody needs a break, I might increase deload calories, back to full maintenance, but I'll never reduce them. I think that's the big difference. But I think that's
another thing,
looking at
as
it.
far as like fatigue management through prep, like programming wise, I think of, okay, where are the harder sessions at in a week?
Mhm.
I'm like, okay, I'm going to put the harder sessions post refeed, because you're well fueled.
That's a great example.
Maybe it's a leg day. Okay, let's you have your refeed on Sunday, let's say, or Saturday and Sunday. You got 2 rest days there. Like, okay, you're well fueled. Monday, leg day. It's the hardest day of the week. Okay, let's put it there. So that way performance is as optimal as we can have it. And then as the week progresses, naturally when you're on lower calories, high step counts, or whatever, the fatigue is naturally going to escalate across those low days. So I try to make this training sessions as much as I possibly can, as long as the life schedule allows for it with people. Make your easier sessions towards the end of the week, where your fatigue levels are higher.
Or even
So
days
it's easier
off.
to get through
Sometimes
the
I'll do it.
sessions. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'll cluster training after refeeds and then just kind of have it taper down to where before the next refeed you get a day or two off.
Yeah.
Even like baseline volume. So let's say, for example, you're averaging 3 sets in exercise. Like, and then we're talking like maybe middle towards the end of prep, where fatigue levels are accumulated quite a bit. Like just on a global scale, it's there. So volume I'll lower down towards the end of the week as well. So instead of 3 sets, and like maybe it's now 2 sets per exercise. It's easier to get through the training sessions. Your performance is going to be better because you're not trying to get through a bunch of volume. And then the aftermath of that, you're not as wiped out after that. So the recovery is a little bit better. So you get through the week, refeed again, higher volume, bring the volume down again, and so on. Whereas, I've had some athletes I've worked with in the past coming from, other coaches and things. It's almost like the opposite. As prep gets deeper and deeper, they're actually going up in volume. Training days are higher in volume time. Like, it's
Calories
like the
are
supply
lower.
and demand perspective. I'm like, the demand's really escalating. They're struggling to keep up with things.
And this is getting...
And usually your physique reflects how you feel usually.
Yeah. And this it kind of it goes to the different ways that you can manage fatigue, like we were talking about earlier, with how a squat really generates a lot of fatigue. And through the majority of my prep last year, I was able to maintain the volume that I had quite a bit through prep, but I was also very open to going to the same number of sets, but with less fatigue generating exercises.
Easier exercises. Yeah.
So as much as I love my squat and as much as that really kind of keeps me in the game in powerlifting, after my powerlifting meet, I had to let it go, and I had to go to the pendulum squat and I had to go to the belt squat. I was able to maintain a lot of the sets during that. And I was actually, probably just talking about the novelty, I was actually able to kind of increase performance with the metrics that I was using. But there again, it was kind of short-lived in a way, because I was progressing for maybe 3 or 4 weeks, but eventually there's so many variables that are being played in that, the repetitions were starting to fall off again. Deadlifts, they had to go by the wayside. I had to go back to a good old-fashioned RDL, where I was not picking it up off of the floor. I was picking it up off of the rack. As that kind of went through, I had to make that even less demanding. So I was just doing just the lengthened portion of the RDLs. I wasn't standing up all the way straight with it. You know what I mean? Because that seemed to be less fatigue generating than it was if I was doing the full range of motion. And I was okay with it, because that was kind of in my opinion, the least important part of the repetition anyway. But yeah, there's all of those variables that we can play with in managing fatigue. It's just a matter of, again, like we said, as practitioners, it's kind of knowing all of the different variables and kind of how they play in. Jeff, you kind of talked about there at the very end, we lost the intensifiers, if people love the intensifiers and they get after it with their training, I might be open to say, okay, let's keep the intensifiers, but let's drop the sets down.
Yeah, I'll say
Bring those sets way down. Maybe, okay, let's not bring the sets down. Let's go to less invasive exercises, and yeah, that's kind of all I feel like touching on what I wanted to talk about with fatigue management over time and kind of over seasons. Brian, you kind of talked about it earlier. Football players don't lift a whole lot of weights when they're in the middle of the football season, because they got to manage that fatigue during that period of time.
I think when the fatigue management stuff, we're not writing it off. Like, we definitely don't want to come across like you shouldn't consider it, like just do what works, like you'll be fine.
Yeah.
It's definitely possible to do too much, but the minutia that a lot of people are obsessed with probably don't make much of a difference until the supply is lower. Like when calories are lower, when sleep is lower, when energy availability, is lower, physical activity is higher. That's when you need to be a little bit more strategic. And so I think, managing training, managing nutrition and prep, a lot of it, like in my experience competing and as a coach, it comes down to like managing the psychological aspect as well. Like I've got 30 weeks of prep. Like I need to get to the end of this intact in order to,
get up on stage.
Put the best, outcome up there. And so, I found you touched on something earlier, Jeff, with like structuring the training within the week and having kind of front loading things. Like my last prep, granted 2017, so it was a while, but I would have a 3-day refeed by the end. This was like in the deepest digging phases that I had. I would think it was Monday through Thursday was like lower calorie days. And then Friday through Sunday, I was back at like just jumped right back up to like ballpark maintenance. And what I found was the number of days that like just subjectively sucked for prep. Like, okay, that was a tough day for prep was like 1.5. Because what I noticed at the front of the week, the training, I would kind of front load my higher volume, higher stimulus. Maybe, if I was doing deadlifts and squats or something, maybe it was earlier in the week. And that's something like maybe you put more length and bias stuff or higher volume stuff after refeeds when you have a little bit more resource available. That's something you could do. But those first 2 sessions, I was coming off 2 refeeds, which were both off days, if I recall correctly. So,
oh, great.
Like that's great. Like that's the other thing that never made sense to me, like lowering calories on rest days, especially in prep, because like if you've ever been in prep, like you don't, if you're just sitting around not doing anything, like it's much harder, the dietary adherence side of things. So if you're just sitting around waiting for your next meal and your calories are 500 less,
looking at the clock,
yeah, this sucks. And so I think mentally it was helpful just to give myself the green light. Okay, soak up this recovery these days. Like these aren't fat loss days, these are recovery days. Yeah, the first, like Monday, Tuesday was fine. By Wednesday, I think I was starting to feel it a little bit. Thursday was definitely the hardest, Yeah. But it was also like when I would typically be hitting my newest lows. So it's like intake was coming down, I was losing a little bit more. Like that was by far, if there was a predictive aspect of weight loss, I hit most of my new lows on Thursdays after the longest string of low days. But even that, so you got kind of rewarded for your efforts there. And then you knew like, okay, this is hard, but I've got 72 hours of refeeds afterwards waiting for me.
You're charging the batteries back
and so,
up.
So how you structure it, consider like how you mentally approach things too. Like if you need like that carrot kind of in front of you to encourage you to keep going, then maybe do 48, 72 hour refeeds and, run low days up to that point and then put your higher volume stuff earlier in the week. And I felt like, that deficit could have been allocated evenly across 7 days. And like I would have had the same deficit on paper, but it would have felt significantly harder.
Would have felt different.
Yeah. So
But you take a
it's-
big step back too, Brian. It's like not
Yeah.
just like looking at it as a week, but like as a prep timeline.
Mhm.
That's what I was alluding
Sometimes
to.
people equate a shorter timeline as less suffering.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas for me, I've learned like a longer timeline, a bigger timeline means less suffering because I can do what you just explained across these weeks is I could better manage everything. You know, I can slow my pace down, or if I need to pick things up, I can pick it up with the thought of knowing like, okay, if I'm going to go fast here, I'm gonna have to pull back at some point. And, you know, I used to have those 12-week preps back in the day and lose like 20 pounds in 20 weeks. It's harder because you're having to push the entire way through. Whereas if you have like you double the timeline up, well, now you can slow that pace down. So it doesn't feel as tough while you're going through it. It's kind of like even the stress factor too. Like if you knowing like the next 8 weeks, you got to be absolutely perfect in order to cross that finish line. You have to be perfect.
Yeah.
You have
No,
you have to have 6 or 7 low days in a row. You got to be super aggressive. The refeeds got to be very minimal because you're fearful of not losing enough body fat. Like it's far more intense. It's far more fatiguing because if you do 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 weeks in a row with barely having any refeeds or whatever, that fatigue is definitely going to creep up, especially if your training is like go hard or go home the entire way through. And we've had a lot of people that's prepped, like not from our athletes, but we've heard these stories. So it's like, I think of it this way. If you were to tie your shoes and I said, all right, I'm giving you 10 seconds to tie both shoes, you can probably get it done, but it's going to be super stressful and your shoes might look like shit afterwards. But if I said, hey, here's 30 seconds to tie your shoes, like you're going to be able to get the job done. Your shoes are going to look nice and clean, nice bows, and it's going to look fresh, but you're going to be not that tired getting the job done. So I think
Yeah,
when
that's
you look
great.
at prep, you got to like that timeline is super, super important.
Jeff, just to expand on basically a personal note on what you were talking about, my easiest prep by far was this last prep. And it sounds unreasonable, but it's talking about what you're talking about. My prep basically lasted over a year. Like I kind of did my first cut right at the beginning of 2023. Got down, pulled the plug on prep. I was like, it's not going to work this year. Gained some weight. Beginning of 2024, started prepping again. I can honestly say of that more than a year that I prepped, the really only hard part was like that 3 weeks right there at the end when we did the 1,700 calories and the 70,000 steps, 17 and 70,000. It was 3 weeks that really, really sucked. And when I was ready to kind of embrace one more week of kind of suffering, and you and I were talking right there in your very office, and you were like, yeah, we're done. You're not going to get any leaner. You know, we're going to increase carbs. We're going to drop these post-failure partials and things like that. I, from that point forward, gained weight and looked leaner and leaner and leaner. And thank God you were in my corner because I probably might have let those numbers kind of play with my head. Even coaches can kind of get in their head a little bit, you know? But I can honestly say, I mean, yes, that prep. Now, keep in mind, here's the little chart. It goes down and then it goes up for a few months, and it goes down and then it goes up and it goes down. Right? That's kind of the trend line. But that was a year and a half that I spent dropping from like 208 pounds down to whatever I was, like 157 or something like that. It was easy. It was all the easiest thing that I have ever done. It was the most enjoyable. And yeah, I'm a 53-year-old dude up there on stage. I don't look like I did when I was 30 years old, but man, was I shredded. And man, did I feel good about how that looked. You know, I didn't even care how I placed. I just knew that I was shredded.
Here's my last sports analogy of the podcast. So that reflects a good boxer, right? A good boxer that, let's say he's not going to get that one punch knockout. He knows he's going to have to go 12 rounds against another really good athlete. He's going to pace himself. He's not going to go 100% for 12 rounds because he's not going to make it. 3 rounds in, he's going to fatigue. He's going to get knocked out. It's like, okay, I'm going to box hard. I'm going to be strategic for 2 or 3 rounds, get in some nice shots, make sure I got my defense up. I'm going to go to my stool and get my rest for a minute. Okay, maybe round 4, I'm going to take that round off, meaning I'm just going to, just flick the jab out there. I'm going to move around enough so I don't use up too much energy. I'm going to pace that round. Then I'm going to go sit down for a minute. And then in the 5th round, I'm going to come out hard. And I might box 2 or 3 more rounds. So you've basically learned how to pick your spots. You learn how to, push, but you also recognize like, okay, I can't keep this pace up. I got to actually recover. So you don't want to be fearful of not throwing any hard punches. And that's,
You got to sometimes, yeah.
that's the people who are fearful of like the fatigue. Like, okay, I'm not going to train hard here. It's like, no, you're going to throw some hard punches. You're going to get some good punches in, but yeah, okay, now you're that's effort there. You're going to have to recover from that. So now you're going to back off a little bit. And then you're going to go again. So you need to learn those thresholds and not to be fearful to get a little tired. If you get a little tired, guess what happens? Like, okay, I got tired. Now I know don't go that hard next time. So you have to learn how to do that. It takes time.
Yeah, and fatigue, it's not a bad thing. It's a necessary evil. We have to have it, and we have to be able to kind of manage it. And I think where I kind of want to end this is how fatigue it looks on our body as bodybuilders, because we are an aesthetic sport, we're a visual sport, and then also how it plays with the numbers. Like I have seen many, many times when people are prepping and they go for like a 2-day hike, right? It's inevitable when they come back, their body weight is way up, right? And it's way up due to what I call non-mass factors, right? That's not in any way, shape, or form body fat nor muscle that you just all of a sudden magically were able to synthesize over the course of 2 days. When we see big jumps in body weight like that, to use Nick's favorite term, multifactorial, right? We've got inflammation. There probably is cortisol there. There's probably all these products of fatigue that are making those numbers make that jump, right? I've seen to where people will go through like a breakup or something like that, where it's extremely emotional, and they're bawling and they've got all this stress over like 2 or 3 days. Make a little note in the chart. Look at what happened there. Whether we were seeing 166s, we see 167, 167 and a half. That is fatigue that kind of plays with those numbers. And then, how many times do you see it after a really hard leg day, you guys, and a dieting bodybuilder, they turn in their photos, their legs look like crap. All the lines that were there that are blurry, it's all fuzzy, you can't see anything. And the last thing that we want to do is get a person up there on stage looking like that, right? So I want to close the podcast out, kind of throwing it into your guys' court. When it comes to that final product,
we're going to talk about tennis. Okay.
No, basketball, Jeff. Basketball. That's what you were talking about.
Tennis, man. I love tennis too.
But yeah, the bodybuilding stage and then also the powerlifting platform. What do we need to do? Because a lot of times fatigue is really high as we're going hard at the beginning of that 5th round, right? Or we're going through that little digging phase in dieting to just kind of get that last little bit of body fat off. We don't want to get up on stage. We don't get up on the platform like that, right? So don't get obviously too much into particulars. The podcast will probably take another hour if we're talking about training tapering. That'll be for another podcast. But you guys on your end, what are kind of your ways to kind of not only eliminate that fatigue right there toward the end, but maybe talk a little bit about the kind of person and how long that takes? Because like I kind of showed, after 4 days of bringing up carbohydrate and bringing down those post-failure partials, I wasn't magically fixed. It was the 6th, the 7th day that was like, wow, my energy's up. Wow, I'm performing a little bit. I'm still starving, but I'm performing a little bit better. I'll talk a little bit about that time component as well.
Yeah. So I think the planning process is a big part of that.
Very true.
Most people are going to have a digging phase in their prep that's tough, and they're going to have that fatigue accumulating. So my goal is to get people lean enough early so we have that time to add food back in and taper calories up and, pull out some of the more lengthened bias movements, things like that. I think that can help quite a bit. Like one thing muscle damage will impair is like glycogen storage. And so if you're accelerating through the finish line at the end of a prep with all of these highly taxing lengthened movements, you're going to be carrying inflammation, and you're probably not going to load carbs very well, or not as well as you could otherwise. So yeah, I think getting the timeline right is kind of the biggest first thing, because there will be, for most people, that stage of prep where like your demand is probably going to be a little bit outside of your supply, just in those digging phases. The key is to, make sure you're well equipped heading into those to, push through those, but also you have an exit strategy that's not, your show 2 days from then. It's, 10 or 14 days to just kind of let things normalize a bit. But yeah, those are the kind of the big things. I think I've had some success. And again, it's kind of going back to what we said earlier. It's hard to say, pinpoint the impact of this specific variable, but taking out things like hinges in peak week, doing something more like a leg curl, or just really taxing movements, even mentally. Like I want people, or not changing rep ranges dramatically. Like if someone's used to 6 to 10 reps on a lot of things, I'm not going to throw in 12 to 15, just because I think it might result like in more glycogen depletion and reuptake. All that's going to do is give them severe
Create more
DOMs
stress.
and more stress, and then they're going to look So it's we don't need to go to extremes, and I think peak week, we're all probably pretty conservative with how we approach peak week. It's never a magic fix, but really it's kind of like a peaking, like that last month is when everything really comes together, and you can drop some of that edema, and just, I've used this term before, but just like marinate at a higher energy availability for a while. And with the athletes less stressed, I think that's the biggest thing. I think stress can impact your look just as much as any of these other variables. If someone's afraid they're going to not get in shape in time, they're going to be more stressed about it. They're going to be more inclined to push, harder as the deadline approaches, which can make things worse. They can kind of snowball. So I think timeline helps mitigate unnecessary stress, and just kind of keeping things similar to what you've been doing with maybe some less lengthened biased work near the end. It seems to cover a lot of the bases for me.
Kind of like what we did with you, Brad. It's like, let's say in general, if you could get someone ready at least 2 weeks in advance, and don't look at peak week as this magical thing. Like I look at peak week as more like, it's probably more like a 2-week process. Because 2 weeks out, like Brian's saying, that's when you want to be like, okay, we're all the fat loss is gone.
Yeah,
it's removed.
the fat's
now
not there. Not getting any
Now
leaner.
we're trying to reduce the fatigue down. So the last 2 weeks should be more like cruise control in a sense. So it's like, it might be raising people's food up, toning step counts down. Maybe it's toning the amount of training volume they're doing. Maybe they're not training as many days. So maybe instead of 5 days, now they're training only 4. They get an extra rest day in there. And then the week of the show, it's like, okay, now this person's like as chilled out as possible. We reduced all that fatigue down. Hopefully mentally they're not as fatigued either. They're like, okay, smooth sailing the last week. And it's just a matter of like, refining that look. So it shouldn't be like peak week, in my opinion, should not be have extremism going on.
Not at all.
Where you're all of a sudden your training is like, okay, now you're doing, like Brian was saying, you're doing all these high rep stuff, trying to deplete out. You're just creating more inflammation, more stress. You're changing up programming. That's for me as my personality, that would stress me out right there. And then you're just trying to keep things as consistent and as predictable as possible. Because when things are consistent, if they're very predictable, especially very stable, that breeds a lot of confidence in people. When there's a lot of swings up and down, some crazy stuff going on, it's like, what's going to happen with this? Like just that question there could create stress. So I think of it like just heading into a show. It's more like at least 2 weeks. It's like, okay, you're kind of landing that plane gently.
Awesome stuff, guys. So I've got all the stuff crossed off on my list here. Any final thoughts, any final words from you gentlemen on the demonization of fatigue and it being more of a necessary evil, but kind of pick your shots and know when you can and recognize the right adjustments to make?
I would just say try to consume your information from like a middle ground. Like try not to, if you're listening to somebody that speaks in absolutes, that I think that's it can be a red flag. So like usually we find ourselves in the middle across like a training career in terms of a balanced approach. So I guess that's I'd like to say that's common sense, but I don't think it is. It's easy to be persuaded.
Well, Brad, I put in a lot of effort with this podcast, like 0 reps in reserve, plenty of sports analogies. It feels like a fifth set of a tennis match and I'm serving for the win. We're an hour and 28 minutes in. So I recognize the fatigue. So I'm going to take 2 weeks off until the next podcast recording. So that way I could come back and hopefully win in 2 or 3 sets instead of 5.
You know your performance is going to be a whole lot better though, right? So, all right, guys, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. It was a very spirited discussion that I enjoyed. Until next time, guys, enjoy the 3D Muscle Journey podcast.